I don't know if you've read Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book. You may have seen the movie. I prefer the animated version to the new. Have you seen the new one? The live action? I wasn't impressed. I'm sticking to the animated. But if you read the book, there's a bit in the book where Mowgli, the man cub, asks the animals, what's the most feared thing in the jungle? And he's told that when two animals meet on a narrow path, one must step aside and let the other pass. And it's the animal that steps aside for none other that's the most feared in the jungle. And then a conversation ensues about which animal it is. And of course, they suggest it might be the elephant that wouldn't let anybody else pass. And others suggest it might be the lion that would not let anybody else pass. And then the wise old owl exclaims, "The most feared thing in the jungle is death. It steps aside for no one." The most feared thing in the jungle is death. It steps aside for no one. Death steps aside for no one. In our hearts, we know it's the very fact of life. We all die. Ecclesiastes says in 7 verse 2, death is the destiny of every human being. And there must come a time when we must feel the sting of it. It's the ultimate statistic, isn't it? 1 out of 1 of us dies. There's no way round it. And I guess as we gather here this morning, we have felt the sting of it at times in our own journeys and in our own life. There is no way round it. Its pain and its sorrow comes to each of us. In the passage that was read for us from Luke's Gospel, we meet a woman who death had dealt a double blow. She'd certainly come to know death, and she'd come to know that death was not her friend. She'd lost her husband, and now death had come knocking at her door again, this time for her son, and her only son. Luke gives us the very clear detail. The husband has passed away, and now her son, her only son, has passed away. Look, why does Luke give us so much detail? Why not just say her son? Why add in the only son bit of the story? Because, of course, that helps to understand how tragic her circumstance is. Of course, it would be tragic in our day and the circumstances now, but in her day, of course, when women did not work for pay. Now, hear me really clearly, they worked really hard, but they didn't work for pay. They worked to bring up family. They worked to make the home. They worked really hard, but it was not for money. And so the husband was to provide the finance for the home and the things that were necessary. And if the husband passes away, it's written into the Deuteronomical laws that, of course, the eldest son is to take responsibility for his mother. And so that responsibility, when her husband passed away, was given to her eldest son. But, of course, her eldest son was her only son. And so when he passed away, suddenly there was no one else to take responsibility for her and to provide for her. And so suddenly she feels helpless and hopeless. All her means of support were gone. Not only was she alone without a husband, grieving the loss of her son, but also questioning, how do I now survive? How do I pay the bill? How do I provide food? Actually, it's a question that's being asked a lot, isn't it, in our own context, for very different reasons. How do we survive? How do we pay the bills? How do we feed those we need to feed? Now, of course, for this woman, as she is about to bury her son, everything feels hopeless. But we have the benefit of knowing the end of the story. So we know that she's about to encounter someone in her journey who can speak hope and life into her situations. And it feels a bit like a coincidence. But the Bible is full of those moments that feel like a coincidence. When Jesus just happens to be in the right place at the right time to encounter somebody who has need. The Bible's full of those. I don't believe they are coincidences, actually. I believe there are moments when Jesus goes to the right place at the right time and goes out of his way to be there. And there are lots of those stories through the pages of the New Testament. I believe Jesus is still the same. I believe Jesus goes out of his way still to meet with us, to encounter us, particularly at those deepest moments of our need. This passage particularly says Jesus and a large crowd, because of course Jesus has been preaching, he's been teaching, he's been healing, and so the crowds have grown, the enthusiasm has grown, people have heard all about the things that's going on, and so the excitement levels have risen, and the crowds have risen, and they're all following Jesus wherever he goes. Pause button on the story. Is that how life works here at High Street? Is there the sense of excitement that goes beyond this place, out into the community, so people hear the excitement of all that Jesus is doing, and so they flock in? Because if we don't tell those stories in our community, who's going to do that? If we aren't the people who are getting excited about what Jesus is doing in our midst, no one else is going to do that for us. We have a responsibility as the people of Jesus, the followers of Jesus, the disciples of Jesus in this community to be telling the stories of all that Jesus is doing, because that's what happens here. People are telling the story. They're getting excited about what Jesus can do, and the crowds flock. I sometimes wonder that if we told the story more, maybe the numbers situation would be different. But I'll just unpress the pause button and leave you to ponder that. The town of Nain. I don't know whether you've heard of it. It's about 25 miles from Capernaum. It's a small town, and the commentaries say it only has one gate. That's one of the ways the commentaries let you know that it's a small town, because the small community would only have one way in or out. If you go to somewhere like Jerusalem and look at the walls around Jerusalem, there's lots of gates. There's lots of ways in and out of Jerusalem because it's a big city. But Nain is a small community, and it only has one gate. I remember I took some students to Jerusalem and to the Holy Land last summer, and we were travelling from Capernaum down to Jericho before we went up to Jerusalem. And as you travel through the mountains between Capernaum and Jericho, you see a little sign. It's really small and it's really easy to miss. And it just says Nain this way. It literally is in the middle of nowhere. It's in the middle of the mountains. It would not be on your top 10 places to visit if you had to make a decision on where you were going to go. Whenever I travel, one of the first things I do when I get into a hotel room, don't know whether you do this, is we get the brochure of the area and flick through the pages to find out where it suggests you must see before you leave. Anybody else do that? No, just me? Okay, I'm obviously a freak. That's fine. If you were to go to Jerusalem or Capernaum or to Jericho and you flick through the must-see places, Nain is not going to be on it. It's not going to be there. Last night, I came down late last night and stopped in a little hotel at Luton Airport, and there was a brochure in the room. Harpenden was not in it. Just need to say, it was not there. You are not in the top 10 places to visit for tourists coming to Luton. Really sorry. You're not there. You are a bit like Nain, although you do have a Costa coffee, so I was very happy. That's the one thing I remembered, because I last preached here during Mark's sabbatical 7 years ago, and my only memory when I was trying to think about the place was there was a Costa about 4 doors down, so I knew I was going to be happy. Jesus went to Nain despite its obscure location. And one of the interesting things about the passage is we don't know why he went. There's nothing else recorded other than this story. We've no idea what his agenda was in going to Nain. And I guess the crowds had no idea. They all just followed him. Wherever he was going, they were following him. They wanted to be wherever Jesus went, and Jesus wanted to be in Nain. Now, of course, we could say it's coincidence, or we could say Jesus went intentionally to meet this woman at this point on her story. Because actually, hope has a name, and his name is Jesus. And when you're in the most hopeless of situations, there is one who can speak hope into that. And we see it again and again and again through the pages of the New Testament. There is one who speaks hope and life and light into the darkest of situations. And it's Jesus. Jesus goes out of his way to a little village called Nain, the obscure, unknown place, to encounter a woman. Now maybe, just maybe, we dare to believe that Jesus goes out of his way this morning to an obscure little place, well, I call it obscure little place, called Harpenden. Because when you're from the north, no one knows where it is. I said to somebody yesterday, I'm coming to Harpenden. They said, where's? I have to say London. And I know that's really offensive, and I apologise. I really do apologise, but it was the only way to describe it, kind of in London and slightly up north a bit. Maybe, just maybe, Jesus goes out of his way to meet you this morning. I don't know why you're here. I don't know whether you're here because this is what you do at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. I don't know whether you're here because actually there's something deep within you and a need that only Jesus can meet. And I guess for more than would dare to admit it, it's the latter of those two. You may put on your very nice Sunday morning veneer of everything's fine, thank you very much, when you're asked how you are, when the reality is there have been tears in the night that nobody else sees, and there's pain that you carry. There's things that burden you. And maybe Jesus goes out of his way this morning to encounter us as we gather. Verse 12 of Luke chapter 7 says, as Jesus approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. Now, of course, as we said, the town only has one gate, so if there's a crowd coming out in mourning, and there's a crowd coming in celebration, they're going to meet at the gate, and that's what happens in this story. There's an encounter moment at the gate of Nain. William Barclay, if you read his commentary, suggests that to this day there is a small cemetery of stones about 10 minutes walk from the gate of Nain. And it was likely this was the cemetery the boy was being carried to on this mountain. Of course, you would not bury inside the town walls. That would not be done. That's why we talk of a hill outside a city wall on Good Friday. Because death, well, you don't want it in the city. It's outside, it's dirty, it's unclean. And so the body is being carried out. Verse 13 says, when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her and he said, don't cry. Well, I'm not sure I quite like the statement, don't cry, to a woman whose son had just died. I'm not sure it's the most pastorally sensitive thing to do. I don't think in our training for ministry it will be pastorally sensitive to say to our ministers, whenever you meet a woman whose son has just died, the first thing you must say to her is, don't cry. Not sure that will be the best teaching method ever. Because it's absolutely natural. We forgive her, don't we, in this moment for crying. It's the natural thing to do. Her heart is broken. Her life has literally gone from her. Everything she'd put her hopes and dreams in, ripped away. And in that moment, in bereavement and in grief, she's sobbing. And Jesus speaks into that. Don't cry. What's he doing? Is he being kind of uncompassionate? Is he doing the, oh, get over it, woman, kind of statement? No, of course he isn't. I sense this as more of an authoritative, don't cry. Don't cry because I'm going to do something about this. Don't cry because this is not the end of the story. Don't cry because I can deal with this. There's a sense here that Jesus is about to do something unexpected in this story. Because, of course, the expected journey ends at the cemetery. The unexpected now happens. And it says Jesus went up and touched the bier, which is like in some translations it uses the word coffin in there, but it would be, the boy would be carried on like a stretcher they call a bier. It says Jesus went up and he touched the bier and he said, young man, I say to you, get up. And then the dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. This is another very frustrating line of scripture. Because Luke gives us so much information, but not for me what is the critical bit of the situation. If a young boy who's been dead for a while suddenly sits up and starts talking, what does he say? Why doesn't Luke tell us what he said? You've told us he sat up, and you've told us he started talking, but you've not told us, what does a young boy who's been dead for a while say when he wakes up? I want to know that. I'm hungry and want to go to McDonald's? Or hello? What does he say? You know, when I get to glory, I'm going to find this young man because I want to know what he said. But there's other points in Scripture, isn't there, where we're left actually just wondering and pondering. We have that story when Jesus meets the woman caught in an act of adultery. And she's thrown at Jesus' feet, and Jesus says to all those around that those of you without sin cast the first stone. And of course, they all one by one disappear, and it's just her and Jesus left. And the Scripture says he kneels down, and with his finger he writes in the sand. If you're going to tell us that he knelt down and wrote in the sand, at least tell us what he wrote. You've left me pondering for the last 40 years of my life. As a preacher, you have a hunch. I would guess it's a word hope, or forgiveness, or restored, or free, but we don't know. But they are the words that come springing to mind in that story. And they are the words that come springing to mind in this story. Hope, restoration, transformation, healing. And of course, this isn't the only story we read where Jesus brings someone back to life. We have the story in Mark 5 of Jairus' daughter, and it says when she was already dead, he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. And the Bible says immediately the girl stood up and walked around. Talitha cum, I imagine to be a bit of an authoritative statement, like don't cry. Talitha cum, I can deal with this. And then, of course, we get the story in John's Gospel, in John 11, where Jesus is at Lazarus' tomb. And, of course, we have an authoritative statement, don't we, of Lazarus, come out. And it says in verse 44, the dead man came out. Authoritative statement where every time Jesus speaks life into dead situations. Jesus speaks words of hope into what seems hopeless. How we long for Jesus to speak hope into the hopeless situations that we face. I don't know what you need Jesus to say into your life this morning, but if you need to hear words of hope, then you're in the right place. There are two things I want you to carry with you into this week, if you can remember them tomorrow. First thing is this. Jesus cares about you and your pain, and he wants to help. I fundamentally believe that to be true. Jesus cares about you and your pain. I simply want to tell you a story. The story takes us back to February 2013, so just over 10 years ago. And now, don't judge me for this. I found myself in a little jazz bar in St. Louis. I was at a conference in St. Louis, on a church growth conference, and I was speaking at a conference, and we had a night off, so 4 of us found a little jazz bar in the middle of nowhere. The jazz wasn't that good, if I'm really honest, but the beer was great, I shouldn't admit that, and the food, we had a gumbo, it was amazing. We'd gone through the evening, and towards the end of the evening, there was a table next to us that we noticed were kind of interested in our conversation. No idea what we were talking about. But then at the end of the evening, this lady stopped and she looked over to us and said, would you just carry on talking? I said, pardon? She said, my daughter loves your accent. Will you just keep talking? You can talk about anything, she said. So clearly we then started talking to the table next to us, and particularly to the daughter who loved our British accent. Apparently it is the king of all accents in the States. You can get anything you want with a good British accent. So we started talking. Eventually we found out the lady who'd spoken to us, her name was Tammy. And Tammy was a Baptist pastor from Nashville. She worked at Tribeca University in Nashville, and she was a grief counsellor and mental health counsellor for the students on the campus. That's what she did. So, great, lovely to meet you, Tammy. At the end of the night, we did those pleasantries where we exchanged telephone numbers and emails. And she said, if you're ever in Nashville, look me up. And I said, if you're ever in Stoke-on-Trent. And she went, where? I said, it's very unlikely you ever will be, but if you are, I was pastor in Stoke-on-Trent at the time, look me up. And we did that very pleasant thing, and I put her number in my phone, she put my number into her phone, and we went our separate ways. Journey on a few months, and we get to July the 31st, 2013. Now, normally, our family holidayed with a couple of other families from the church. We'd been to Jersey for a couple of years together, but this particular summer, my wife and I decided we were going to go all out on the big Disney holiday. So we blew every pot of money we could possibly find in our bank accounts, and we did Disney. For 3 weeks we were going, 2 weeks in Disney, and then we were going to drive up through the Great Smoky Mountains, through St. Louis, where we have friends, and up to Chicago. That was our plan, amazing holiday. We've been planning it for a long time. So we arrived in Florida at Disney. We'd been there about a week, and then on July the 31st, I got a phone call that changed the course of my life. I found out that my best friend had died instantly. He'd been on holiday in Jersey. We should have been with them. That's where we often went. He'd been on holiday in Jersey where the families were. He'd been on a bike. He'd tripped, fallen off his bike, and gone under a lorry instantly that had travelled past. And he died instantly. When you get a telephone call like that, Disney is not the best place to be. You're hearing the where dreams come true constantly around you. And so, as a family, we were completely broken. They had children, 3 children under the age of 12. Our children were a similar age. It was one of those moments of what do we do now? We're a week into the kind of 3-week dream holiday. Well, we said, we've got friends in St. Louis, let's just drive to St. Louis for a couple of days before we go home, knowing that when we get home, we were going to have to lead the church through a time of grief. He was the worship pastor at the church I was at. We were going to have to lead the church through a time of grief. We've got to support our friends through a grieving period as we were grieving ourselves. Let's just take a couple of days with some friends before we journey back. So we shut the door on the villa we were in Orlando, and we drove through the Great Smoky Mountains heading towards St. Louis, which was our plan. If you drive through the Great Smoky Mountains, you have to arrive at a place called Gatlinburg. I don't know if you've ever been to Gatlinburg. It's a bit like Blackpool in the Great Smoky Mountains. Terrible place. Sorry, I just did a judgment on Blackpool. I apologize. Blackpool's a great place. Gatlinburg, not so good. It's the home of a theme park called Dolly World. Yes, the name says it all. And we didn't go, obviously, but I drove past the entrance to Dolly World. But Gatlinburg had been the place where I got some phone signal for the first time in about 24 hours, because in the mountains we'd got no phone signal. And as we drove into Gatlinburg, so this is now early August 2013, so a few days on from July the 31st. We drove into Gatlinburg, and my phone suddenly started beeping, because we'd suddenly got signal, so texts and things had started coming through. One of the texts I opened up in Gatlinburg was from a lady named Tammy. Her text, which I still have on my phone, I kept it because I just was astounded by what I read. The text said, "Hi, was prompted to think and pray for you this morning. Hope you're doing okay. Tammy." My reply was, "Tammy, we're driving through Nashville in about an hour. Can we come and see you?" Because Gatlinburg is about an hour out of Nashville, and that was our route through to St. Louis. About an hour and a half later, we were sat in Tammy's office, which is where, as a family, we spent about 24 hours, as she deeply ministered to us as a family. In that moment, the word coincidence was removed from my vocabulary. That what seemed to be a chance meeting nearly 6 months earlier in a bizarre little jazz club in the outskirts of St. Louis, a bit of a dive, if really honest, became holy ground, where God was at work. And in the moments that we needed him most, he moved so that Tammy was there for us. It was exactly what we needed before we then journeyed home. I believe Jesus goes out of his way to meet with you. I believe Jesus cares about your pain. He cares about what you carry, the things that you carry. The things that nobody else sees, the tears you cry in the middle of the night, he sees. That's why the psalmist writes in Psalm 56, "You, O Lord, hear my pain. You have kept a record of my tears." Or the psalmist says in 31 verse 7, "Lord, you have seen the crisis in my soul." We worship a God who sees. We worship a God who sees deeper than anyone else. We worship a God this morning who sees right the way in, when no one else can get, reaches to the parts nothing else can reach, not even Carlsberg. That was a link to an advert, just in case you're not sure. Or was it Heineken? I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't even quote beer adverts, so we'll just leave that. Jesus sees beyond and deeper and in. And so the first thing to carry, Jesus cares and sees. But that's not the end, is it? Because the second thing to carry is actually Jesus has the power even over death. Jesus has the power over... If Jesus has the power over death, he has the power over everything. Death we describe as the final enemy. If Jesus has the power over death itself, then there is nothing that you can face that is beyond him. There is nothing that you can face that is outside of his ability to meet, to heal, to restore. And of course, this miracle, as in the ones with Jairus' daughter and Lazarus, is a hint of things to come when, of course, he, on Easter Sunday morning, bursts from the tomb with that authoritative statement that death is defeated once and for all. There is nothing. And Jesus has the power in this scenario to turn what was a funeral celebration, funeral procession, into a celebration of praise and worship. I've done a lot of funerals over the years, as folk, I guess Mark would say he has done a lot as well. I was a pastor of a fairly large church in Stoke-on-Trent, and in Stoke-on-Trent everyone's a Methodist, whether they are or they aren't. They have a Methodist history. Someone in their story has been a Methodist. So we had lots of funerals, because if they don't know what they are, they're a Methodist. So we had hundreds of them. The best, and I use the word the best really carefully, the best are those when you lead a celebration of someone who's committed their life and tied their future to Jesus Christ. Because you know in that moment that death is not the enemy. Death is not the enemy. There is more, and there is hope, and there is hope in what can seem like the darkest of situations, because there is one who has defeated death, and those that trust in him have a hope and a certainty of a future that goes well beyond death itself. Jesus could turn this funeral around. He can turn whatever you face around. Romans 15 verse 13, I'll conclude with these words, says this: "May Jesus Christ, the source of all hope, fill you with joy and peace through your faith in him." May Jesus Christ, the source of all hope. If things feel hopeless, there is a source of hope, because hope has a name, and his name is Jesus. What's amazing about this story is that it began with two processions. One rejoicing, one mourning. One heading to the city, one heading to the cemetery. But amazingly, Jesus turned two processions into one amazing parade of joy. No more mourning that day, just gladness, because the one who brings life to dead situations was at work. The one who speaks hope into hopeless situations was at work. The one who brings light into the darkest of situations was at work. Rudyard Kipling got it wrong in the story. Rudyard Kipling completely got it wrong. The statement, "Death steps aside for no one," is not true. We are resurrection people. Death steps aside for Jesus. That's what this story tells us. Death itself defeated once and for all. That is the Christian hope. Death steps aside for no one. Rubbish. Steps aside for Jesus. What do you need this Jesus to speak into your life this morning? We're going to just spend a moment in prayer as we open ourselves to the one who goes out of his way to meet with us here. This obscure little place, whether it be a jazz bar in St. Louis or High Street in Harpenden, there is one who meets us here. And there is one who longs to speak hope, to bring life, and to shed light into your life this morning. So let's just be still. And let's just pray. And let's open ourselves to him at work in us as we invite his Holy Spirit to meet with us here.